Mike and Matt bringing back the mid to late 90s. Mike and Matt bringing back X-Files CCG.
Welcome back, everybody, to part deuce of Matt and Mike Stevens X-Files CCG. We're going to continue on our deep dive of the playtest cards. And again, I know I've said it, and you can yell at me for wasting your time, but you guys made this happen. You're getting you're getting Dax to Philefest, man. You guys are making this happen. I had these cards. I was stupid. I wasn't really looking at them. Dax had the foresight to say, hey, Mike, you should probably scan those in and get copies of them before you send them out to people. I was like, really? Okay, I guess I can do that. All right, cool. 2 weeks later, hey, Steven, take a look at these things. Hey, Mike, you realize there's like 5 million changes in these things that you probably should have been aware of? Oops. So, thanks. Thank you, everybody, for helping Dax get there and being a part of this.
Yes, thank you.
It wasn't a set price. I wasn't selling them for any specific amount of money, but like you guys are making this happen, so we're happy. You can make it up to me by coming to Philefest in Minnesota the week of September 8th, 9th, and 10th. We're going to be there. We're going to be putting on a tournament, and come hang out with us. But until then, let's talk about some more 10-13 card differences, Stephen. What do we got up next?
Exactly. So, as you recall in the previous video, we discussed the notable differences between Mulder, Scully, Skinner, and Krychek's agent cards, which, again, as we stated in the previous video, we don't know if these are pre-premiere agent cards or if they were slated to be revised agents for upcoming editions of the games that we unfortunately didn't get to see because everything went belly up. But much like with the cards that came before, there obviously was a lot of brainstorming and a lot of ideas that had to get either axed all together or revised before we saw the final product. And in some cases, it was very minimal. Sometimes it was just the matter of a title change, which you're going to see a lot of that. However, there's some other noticeable differences in that of, like, say, the cost of the card was modified. Sometimes even the rarity of the card that we know was slated to be somewhat different rarity at the time that these playtest cards were conceived. And so that's what we're going to go over today. And we'll start with the adversaries. The first one being the adversary, the Walk. And this is an interesting effect.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Sorry to interrupt. I just, I was reading this, and so it's called the Walk, but it says you may have up to 2 of each version of the Walk in your deck. Subtract 1 from all damage sources applied to this adversary. Well, that's kind of interesting. So remember Margie and Carrie, right? You combine them. They were cool adversaries that kind of work together. This almost seemed like they wanted to have multiple versions of the same card that weren't technically the same card, so you could have more than 2 of it in your deck. It's an interesting idea, actually.
Right, and interesting that they applied it to this particular card in that the adversary of this episode was a singular villain, Lieutenant Leonard Trimble, Rappo, as he was called. But here's the other interesting detail, Mike, and you know from having scanned all of these, and I know from having looked at all of the other playtest cards.
I just scanned them. You actually looked at them.
Right. You scanned them, I looked at them. There is not another version of this card in the 10-13 playtest cards that we have here. There are 2 printings of this adversary, the Walk, but looking at them, they are identical. There's no difference in that. So it does beg the question of what the other version was supposed to be. Now, here's another interesting detail about this, is that the effect for the adversary, the Walk, is very similar to that of Joseph Patnick. The key difference is that in the case of Joseph Patnick, the long-range combat round is skipped, and the price of Joseph Patnick is actually a little bit cheaper, although he is way more devastating of an adversary to play. But the effect of subtract 1 from all damage sources applied to this adversary is found on the walk as well as Joseph Patnick. Now, in all of the playtest cards that we have here, and we have about 130-ish, if I'm not mistaken, although some of them were just blank altogether, there is no Joseph Patnick playtest card.
Yeah.
So it would seem to be that at some point they did revise the effect for the adversary, the walk, to have 2 of each. This whole 2 of each versions of the walk was later altered to just be Joseph Patnick, and which is probably a wise choice because, again, the villain of the walk was a singular villain.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we talked about in the last video too. Is the spirit of the game. It was everybody that was coming up with these crazy ideas, like, hey, let's do this and this and this and this, and they'd get these playtest cards and they'd try them, and I'd be willing to bet at some point using these cards, somebody went, all right, I think we should probably change this up.
That is very true. And I do know from having done a baker's dozen of playtests for the Season 4 expansion that there were some ideas where initially when I conceived them, they sounded great. They looked great on paper, but when you put them into effect, when you're squaring off with another opponent and you're playing this card, it's oftentimes not until then that either there's a very fuzzy aspect of the mechanic, or it is too far out of left field, or it's too powerful to the point that you got to dial it back sometimes. And it's no surprise, given that there, at the time when 1013 was released, that they were working in the neighborhood of 400 cards up to that point, because they picked, we had about 350 cards from Truth Is Out There in Premiere, and then we had another 130 some odd cards for 1013. You have to figure at some point you're going to have a lot of ideas that have to get dialed back or axed all together, because not every one is going to be a gem.
Well, let's move on to Witnesses, right?
Yes, that was the only adversary for the 1013 playtest that stood out. The others, as you saw in the commercially released versions of 1013, were, virtually identical. But there were noticeable differences in the Witness, some of them more interesting than others. But the first one we wanted to talk about was Navajo Elder, which, again, is because I'm putting the images up here for you guys to see. You can see the differences in these cards from the playtest card to the commercial release ones. But with respect to Navajo Elder, the only difference is that the playtest card was titled Navajo Elders. Was it? They just dropped the S from there, and sometimes the changes were just that minute. And although it is interesting to think about with this, not just the playtest card, but the 1013 version of Navajo Elder is just, it features Albert Hosteen, who was previously an agent card in Premiere and Truth Is Out There. So it's interesting, the thought process behind using Albert as a witness when he already existed as an agent card. But it is possible, and this is a talking point I want to come back to as we get to a couple of the cards later in this list of cards we're talking about, is the level of access that those designing these cards had to the images from the series. Now, for one, we do know that they had certain restrictions on some images they couldn't use, most notably in the Symbol of Faith equipment card. But it also could be that they just didn't have all the images from the show available to them, to the point that they had to resort to just using whatever image that closely reflected the card that they were trying to talk about. And not always to some success. I always joke about the 1013 site, Striker's Cove at Hevelman's Lake, just being a close-up shot of Mulder's profile as opposed to an actual lake. So, and it could be in just, again, a situation where they just didn't have another image that they could incorporate into the card. And so that's quite possibly what happened here with Navajo Elder or Navajo Elders, where maybe they had a different image in mind to feature some of the unnamed Navajo Indians that participated in the Blessing Way ritual. Okay, so the next witness we want to talk about is a rather interesting one. in that it is Sheriff John Teller, who you'll see over here is a witness from 1013, and you'll recall the character was a more antagonistic member of law enforcement who wasn't necessarily a fan of Mulder and Scully digging into the case of Darren Peter Oswald. So, because Sheriff Teller was a bit more of an antagonistic character in the show, as was another witness that we'll talk about in a little bit, the early conception, as you'll see from the playtest card that's up on the screen, is that Sheriff John Teller had the option of either adding or subtracting from a team's criminal investigation or science skill check, and that was dependent upon the flip of the top card of your bureau deck. If the card had an RP cost, you get to add 2 criminal investigation or 2 sciences. However, if the card had a CP cost, then you subtract 1 from the skill check, and so the owning player must designate which skill prior to flipping the card, because he did have either criminal or sciences to allocate. But it's interesting to note that there was a possible chance detrimental effect to the investigating team depending upon the flip of a card.
Well, one thing I wonder about too, honestly, Stephen, is you go back to Premiere, and all of the witnesses, or not all of them, but a vast majority of them, they added 1 to this skill or 1 to this skill. None of them were really resources, right? I mean, there were obviously a few. Kevin Morris.
Yep.
It was Kevin Morris and Kristen.
You talk about the RP generating witnesses. Yeah, but there were also 2 witness cards, Dr. Diamond and Samantha Mulder, who also have a keyword resource in that they could contribute to team skill checks across multiple rounds. But yes, we also had for Premiere the 4 RP or 5 RP generating witnesses, which those were axed after Premiere, which was a shame because those were amongst my favorite witness cards.
It was a shame, but also, I mean, you think about it too. Like, I'm not sure if they thought about how people would build their decks, because the way that it is now, like, and I don't know about you, this is the way that I build a deck, is I first pick out what my team is.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Right?
You kind of have to. Yeah.
Right? And if you have evidence collection, okay, I've got 2 here, 2 here, 3 here, 1 here. All right, cool. There is no chance I'm putting a witness in my deck that gives me extra evidence collection. It's just a waste of space. And I think that was like a big flaw that I think they realized right away, because they started making these witness cards and adding different effects. Before it was like add 1 to evidence collection or buyers, add 1 to computer, right? But then they're like, okay, wait a minute. Let's add some different effects to these things, because I'd be hard pressed to talk to a person that actually has a witness card in their deck that does, like buyers, that does something as simple as that for the cost. It just doesn't seem worth it.
But anyway, let's get back to Sheriff Teller, because there's one other aspect of this card that is very interesting. The witness card, as you'll see, is titled Sheriff John Teller. The effect was significantly reduced to that he was just reduced to just your basic witness. He adds 2 to team's criminal investigation, 1 to team sciences, end of story. However, in drafting the cards for the 22364 Scully expansion, they decided to utilize the Sheriff Teller character once again, but this time as a bluff card, and perhaps more appropriately so. And as you'll see from the bluff card that I've put up here, you'll see that Sheriff Teller's card bluff card effect was that it would be played to change the site prerequisite to Sciences 3. So it was they revisited that for the Scully set, but unfortunately we didn't get to see that aspect of the card. But it's another interesting, like the Navajo Elders card previously mentioned, in that sometimes they, very rarely, but occasionally, they would utilize the same character for different card types with vastly different effects. And that's just another interesting insight into the thought process of those designing the cards, Ron Kent, Duncan, and anyone else who might have been involved in those brainstorming sessions. The character of Dr. Jeff Eckerly as a witness card is interesting in that he wasn't entirely a helpful witness in the episode, and so the early playtest version of the card, as you can see, had an effect that was similar to that of the previously mentioned Sheriff Teller card, in that it would either add or subtract to one team's computer or sciences skill check based on the chance flip of a card, the top card in your bureau deck. If the card has an RP cost, it would add 2 to those aforementioned skills. However, if it was a CP card, you would subtract 1, and again, the owning player would designate which of those 2 skills, computer or sciences, that would apply prior to the card flip. So Eckerly and Teller were the 2 witnesses in these 1013 playtest cards that had a noticeably different effect that did not get translated to the final version of the 1013 expansion, with one exception, and that would be the Stupendous Yappy, who had an effect that was based on a card flip. So what we see here with these 2 cards did somewhat make it into the finalized version in the form of the Stupendous Yappy card, but only with respect to that card alone.
Man, I gotta say, like, again, man, you are just an encyclopedia of this stuff, man. Like, when Matt and I started this channel, we're like, yay, another Kresge. What episode was that from again? It's the one with the Lucy Householder chick. Like, yeah, this, like, we didn't know these, like, we played the game. We were probably, David May, I'm sure, has said this before, we were more gamers at that time than we were, knowledgeable about the show. We knew about the show, we watched the show, we loved it, but we didn't know every line, man. But that brings me to the next card, the first sight, which is the difference. And your talking point on this one, I read this one and I was like, damn, son, like, how do you even know this stuff?
The site in question, and again, as you'll see as it's up on the screen here, hails from the episode Grotesque. The finalized version of the card was titled Moscow Studio, Washington, D.C. However, looking at the playtest version of the card, you'll see that they utilized the address of Moscow Studio, 1222 South Dakota Street, Washington, D.C. Same place, but they ultimately just decided to call it Moscow Studio, and I think that was a wiser choice because the address doesn't necessarily convey exactly where the agents were. So with this particular case, it was an appropriate title change. The aspect of the card that I don't like so much is that the image that you see on the finalized card is actually not of Moscow Studio, but it shows Agent Scully and Fred Nemhauser in the hospital where one of the victims was hospitalized after surviving the assailant's attack. So it's actually the hospital you're seeing in that image, not Moscow Studio. And that could be one of 2 things. Again, as we mentioned, perhaps they didn't have the level of access to all the images that they needed for these cards. Or, as is another possibility, is that Moscow Studio was perhaps too dark for them to really appropriately put on one of these cards. Because you do notice when you look at some of these images that they are enhanced and brightened significantly compared to what you see when you watch the episodes, and that is to give them from not having like a dim quality to the images. And so they really did have to tick up the level of brightness for a lot of these cards.
It could also be like, honestly, man, this as much as I do, it could have just been laziness. I'm sorry, Dave Frank, but let's look at tracking the killer.
Very true. Maybe, the chips were down, the deadlines were approaching rapidly, and they didn't realize that, this screenshot that we have here of Scully talking to Agent Nemhauser is actually in a hospital.
Yeah, who knew?
Could have been.
Well, let's move on here, man. Let's get to events. These are some of my favorites.
Yes.
As far as the changes are concerned. I did see these before I disseminated the cards. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Navajo. Is it Hogan?
Hogan, yeah.
Hogan. that was later renamed to Ceremony. And basically it says 3 tokens versus 2 tokens, and they later amended that for a believer agent, which I find amazing. By the way, that's a good thing to
Very
do.
faithful.
Exactly. Because you wouldn't have, Dana Scully like, yeah, just go lay in that tent and get healed by these guys. You're like, well, why?
Right. And as she later said in the season 6 finale, Biogenesis, when she was standing outside the Navajo Hogan and telling Dr. Sandoz, yeah, I don't want to go in there while they're performing the Blessed Way ritual because she doesn't share their beliefs, as she said. So to make this card limited to just believer agents was a very, very faithful translation of this card effect from the events of the episode. And I like that because we did not see a whole lot of cards that played to the differences found in the agent keywords, noticeably the believer versus the skeptic agents, the independent versus the keyword law agents, the neutral versus the non-neutral agent cards. We didn't get to see a whole lot of cards that tackled those differences in the agent cards.
So I'd like to ask you. So I noticed on this card particularly that it was changed from a common. It's listed as a common. Ultimately, it was changed to a rare card. But there are a couple of numbers on the bottom of those that we haven't talked about.
Yeah, and these numbers are peppered throughout all of the cards that you're going to see put up on the screen here. And I got to say, I'm at a loss. I've looked at them, but I haven't found a pattern. They do not they look like a standard date.
The only thing, as far as in this case, it says 11/29/20. The thing that I've been noticing about these cards is, I almost wonder, and I mean, I'd have to sit down and actually prove this, and you internet sleuths, if you want to do this, go nuts. But it almost seems to me like those are timestamps for the image.
Yeah, that could be it's telling where in the episode that the screen cap that they have in mind is from. Now that is interesting. But then again, you don't have the timestamp on, say, the adversary.
Some of the other, like the walk.
Yeah. Now, it could be the instances where there's not a timestamp listed on the card. It could be that they did not have a specific image in mind when they were conceiving these, and so they didn't have a timestamp. But in certain cases, maybe they did have it like, okay, we want the image to be roughly from here. But in some cases, it was like, well, we don't have an idea.
Yeah, this one's interesting. Originally, Fox Mulder has a near-death experience. You seemed to see less cards in 1013 have specific agent names. You remember Premiere? It was Agent LaManna dies, and Skinner adopts the company line, and they were more focused. But in 1013, they seem to be more generic, I guess. Is that the right word?
I gotta say, I think the differences in the title change probably stems from the fact that they did not have enough space in the title portion of the card to incorporate that whole thing. Sometimes, and I know from working with Dax on a lot of these fan-made cards, that sometimes I have a title in mind that he just comes back to me. He's like, that title's just too long. It's just not going to work. We need to, cut down on it a bit. And that was especially a issue with some of the killer cards that I conceived, like Pendrell's killer card or Fred Nemhauser's killer card.
Right. All right. So what do we got next? Event Visit from the First Elder.
Mm-hmm.
Slight title change, spelled out, first versus the number first. And then differences in game effect. Play this card and remove it from the game versus show your opponent this card, discard this card.
But not remove it from the game.
Not remove it from the game. I think probably that was changed because removing a card from the game it's a pretty serious thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of wanted to keep the sacredness of that, I think, a little tighter to the vest. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I believe so. Because up until that point, you had very few instances outside of killer cards in which.
And Deep
Yep.
Throat and yeah, that's all I can
Yeah,
think
Clyde
about.
Brookman's
Yeah.
effect was that he could remove a card from the game. That was the most notable addition to the 1013 expansion that involved removing a card from the game. The only other one I can think of is maybe the Lucy Householder witness card. Again, a pretty unique witness effect. But beyond that, that's about all I can think of off the top of my head.
So we all know Unexpected Call. I have 2 of them in most of my decks. Basically, play this card, allow you to exchange resource pools with your opponent. It's 0 cost. An amazing card, but originally it was called, quote, "Who gave you this number?" Kind of cool, actually, because they do speak, or he does speak that at the beginning. So, I mean, it's a line from the show, but the cool thing, or the cool change, I guess, that I saw that would have absolutely been the deciding factor for me, at least, to have this card in your deck or not, is originally the resource cost was 5.
5.
That's huge, man. Right? Because, I mean, if I have, 5 in my pool, I'm thinking about playing a Deep Throat. I'm thinking about playing, Grid Pattern Search. I've got all these other things in mind, right? But if I've got nothing in my resource pool and you're sitting on 15 over there, you know what? Let's trade it up. That's insane. Right. And that's why this card, if I'm not mistaken, it's an ultra rare.
It is an ultra rare, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why. And even on this playtest card, it was an ultra rare because of how crazy it can shift the game.
Tong Lottery Jar. It's an event card. But box. The most notable difference on this card is just that the word jar was originally going to be box. That's it. Yeah. Beyond that, there was some slight refinement of the game effect, but not really the game effect, but more the text itself. This is a very text-heavy card effect compared to some of the other ones, and they were probably hard pressed for space with the playtest version of it. And so I've had that happen a lot of times where I have a very hypertextual card effect that ultimately Dax comes back and says, hey, you need to take a few words out of here. I just can't fit that and the flavor text at the bottom in here and give you a serviceable card. So that was probably where it says like discard the Tong Lottery box versus discard this card. It's more concise, takes up less space.
Yeah. Now, interesting little note I just noticed about this one just right now. Look at the possible timestamp.
Yeah, so again, it's possible this was a situation where they had maybe 2 different images in mind, or maybe the other one was of the Tong Lottery box versus the jar. That could be another possibility. But 2 possible images they had in mind. It's like whichever one, choose from these 2.
Well, moving on, we got the Men in Black. This one's pretty standard. Doesn't require a lot of thought. The only difference is instead of the Men in Black, it was just Men in Black. Notable difference is instead of 6 RP conspiracy points, it was originally 8. So I think probably just a game balancing thing, probably used a few times, and probably the complaint came up, I think this is a little expensive for what it does. Let's lower the cost a little bit, which, as I'm sure Steven is aware, and working with Dax too, with even the Scully set on some of these cards, you kind of have that discussion like, okay, well, how much should this cost? How much shouldn't it cost? How is it going to be balanced? And I think it was just a balancing issue that probably came up after the playtesting, and
this is one I would imagine playtesting proved most helpful in helping them decide how they wanted to allocate the cost of this, because this is one of those cards where if it comes up late in the game, then you're really not going to have much time to recoup the CP expense of playing that card. If it comes up late in the game, if it comes up at the beginning, sure, great. But late in the game, when there's not much time to get to utilize this resource card, Yeah,
Yep.
the 8 CP is a bit tough to swallow, and you really don't see outside of adversary cards. You don't see a whole lot of conspiracy cards that cost more than 6. 6 tended to be the max with respect to events and bluffs.
Yeah. All right, moving on. We're going into bluffs real quick, right?
Yep, time for the bluffs. And so, with
Yeah.
respect to the first one, which was ultimately titled Final Repose, the early iteration of this card was simply Nightmares.
I can understand why originally it would be, oh, this is a nightmare that he's having. But when you watch the episode, when you listen to Clyde Bruckman, and here's where Michael geeks out a little bit because it is one of my favorite episodes. When you listen to Clyde Bruckman, he's not describing a nightmare. He's describing the knowledge of how he dies, and he doesn't sound panicked. He doesn't sound upset, right? He's just
Resigned.
I imagine myself in a field and the flowers are rotting around me, but he's never upset. It's never a callous moment. It's his final repose, and I'm really glad they changed the card name on this one, honestly. And I know that's the only difference in this case, but I'm glad you put this one in here because it just, from a storytelling aspect, it just makes a lot more sense to me.
One other aspect of this card I do want to talk about before we move on to the next one is we've been referencing one of the more mysterious aspects of these playtest cards, specifically the 1A, the 1B. But if you look at this particular one, it just says B.
Yeah, it just says B.
There's no 1 in there. So again, Brian Woodward, I hope you can clear this up for us as to what that means.
Yeah.
And that does prove to be the case with actually this next bluff too. It has the simply the letter B on there. And again, it is from Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, the finalized version being Visions of a Madman, which ultimately stayed the same. The only two differences with respect to this card is that the cost was initially 2 CP, but then later amended to 3 CP. And that probably had to do with the fact that if they played it face down. So it was a question of maybe we need to up this cost when you factor in the -1 applied to playing it face down. The other... go ahead.
I was going to say, one thing that drives me nuts about this card is this card, I know it's a rare.
Mm-hmm.
It was listed originally as an uncommon, and it was finalized as a rare. But as far as I'm concerned, the actual availability of this card in particular is ultra rare status.
It's not very often it comes up in those boosters.
Next to
we have another block.
Oh, great difference between titles.
Absolutely.
Man. Great difference. Now, you remember what I said about Final Repose, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the opposite of this card. I think the original title for this was better. The original title, Caught Between a Rock and a Hard Place, finalized philosophical question. I understand why they went with philosophical question. I know Mulder and Scully are sitting on this rock in the middle of this. They think it's the middle of the lake, right? Rest in peace, Quick. Oh, yeah. Right? But it was literally they're on a rock and they're in a hard place, right? I thought it was a perfect title. I don't know what do you think?
And I think they changed the title based more not so much on the image, but rather the flavor text. So that was an interesting, and also could have been maybe a question of space. Caught Between a Rock and a Hard Place obviously would take up 2 lines of that title. And sometimes, for the sake of aesthetics, it could have been just that they simply decided to fall on a 2-word title just to make it so that the title would only be 1 line. And that is present for the majority of those cards with very, very few exceptions. The rarity for this card was
changed.
Uncommon initially as per the playtest card, but later amended to common. And this is actually a card that I do occasionally use in my deck from time to time. It is one of those 10-13 bluffs that initially you look at and you're like, that doesn't sound very appealing. But then when you actually played it in the course of a game, surprisingly, it does work out. But it doesn't always work out. But when it does, it's pretty awesome.
All right, which one we got next?
The
Glenn?
last of
You're
the
up.
bluffs is Veracity in Question, which, as you can see on the early playtest card, was He Knows Where You Work. And that is one where I think they had a different image or a different point in the episode in mind from what you see on the finalized version, in which Mulder is pointing his gun at the cigarette smoking man, and is not inclined to believe what the smoking man is telling him about at that point regarding his visit to Mrs. Mulder. Um, he knows where you work. And if you look at the flavor text, which is found on the playtest card, which is completely different from what was on
Oh
the
yeah,
finalized bluff, um, calls back to the very philosophical conversation that the cigarette smoking man had with Jeremiah Smith, who at the time was imprisoned, and they were having a very deep philosophical discussion that I think was inspired by the Brothers Karamazov by Tolstoy. But they ultimately decided to go with a different image, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. They ultimately decided to go with a different image, one that used this image that you see here, and because of that, the title "He Knows Where You Work" doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So therefore, they had to not only change the flavor text but change the title as well. Now, the other thing that's worth noting about this card is that at the very bottom, it says Talitha Kumi, which is the name of this episode, the season finale for season 3. It says, no TC video, call next games. No TC,
yeah,
Talitha Kumi, the title initialized.
yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure who got this card. I know I don't have it anymore, but whoever got this card, kudos, because again, if I had done my due diligence and actually looked at these things, I absolutely would have kept this card. So good for you.
Yeah.
Um,
So the bottom, that last little note at the bottom, kind of speaks to what I've been saying a bit earlier about some of these cards, where maybe they didn't have all of the images or video available to them
yeah.
to determine what image they wanted to put on these cards.
Moving on, what do we got next? So let's get into
Equipment,
the last. I believe the last of them, right? The equipment cards,
yes, equipment, then, and that's it, because 1013 did not have combat cards. Thanks, probably in large to Dave Frank. I'm sure he had a lot of say in that.
Oh man, I would have thought Dave Frank would have been like all the combat cards to go in this. But so what's the first equipment card we got here?
And this is one that I had claimed, in exchange for a generous donation on Dax's behalf. The equipment card stationary from the third season episode Piper Maru, which is one of my favorite Mytharc episodes. As you'll note from the playtest version, as you see on the screen here, the title of the card was originally Notepad, but later changed to Stationary, and that is more appropriate change because, as Mulder says in the flavor text noted on the card, is that when he's speaking to Miss Kalinchuk, he says that he has this letter that was typed on J. Kalinchuk Salvage Broker's stationery, which, yeah, to call it a notepad makes me think more of like a law enforcement officer who's
Yeah,
taking notes while interviewing a witness.
yeah.
Though granted, Mulder and Scully didn't really do a whole lot of that in the course of their investigations. One, Mulder had a photographic memory, and Scully's just awesome like that. It's like, I don't need a notepad. So
Yeah, the
yeah.
next one. Yeah, sorry. Killer leaves clues versus classified ad. Um, like as far as a generic card title goes for the game itself, classified ad probably better. Um,
Mhm.
Killer leaves clues is more specific on the episode itself.
Right. It sounds more like a title of an event card or something like that, not so much of an
Yeah,
equipment card.
might be an interesting title to carry over to further set actually in the form of an event card. So.
I agree. I definitely agree because, and I do want to call back to that earlier bluff card. He knows where you work. While that title was not used ultimately in the finalized version, Dax did take the liberty of creating a bluff card that utilized that title
Yeah.
from the same episode. So bravo to Dax. And if anyone's interested in taking a look at that card, they just need to go to the Facebook group and look under the album playtest cards, and you'll find that bluff there. And of course, if you're interested in acquiring the card, just message Dax like always.
Next one, we got kind of a twofer here.
Yep.
You know, just another couple of equipment cards. Nothing crazy. Brain scan originally versus MRI.
Apples,
Pretty-
yeah,
pretty
apples
much.
and apples.
Yeah.
Nothing different
and
there.
then the next one is now this one's a little bit more interesting because we had always seen, Matt and I had always seen this card. We'd pull this card out of a pack and we'd be like, huh? And originally called Evidence of Predation, now changed over to Decomposing Victim.
Mhm.
Now, no matter what you call it, I would not consider half of a human guy with his fly down a piece of equipment.
Right.
Just
It
throwing
does.
that out there.
It's certainly a piece of evidence, though. You know, compared to all of the other equipment cards that make up the Premier Truth Is Out There and 1013, it does stand out in terms of its lack of convention or tradition.
Weirdness. Yes.
Very much so.
If I had to lump like certain cards, like, wow, these are the greatest cards in the entire set. Okay, you know, Deep Throat, Unexplainable Time Loss, and then I have this whole other category of cards that they were just like, you know, DGF, if you know what that means. I'd be like, Tracking the Killer, Dead Guy, you know.
Oh yeah.
It's just crazy to me that this ended up being an equipment card, but you know.
Maybe they were just very fond of the image and they're like, you know what, guys, I don't care how or where. I don't care if you make an equipment card or what. Just make sure this image finds its way in there.
Well, we're down to our last card now. And
down to the last one.
It's another equipment card, but I believe you got this one, didn't you?
I do.
Yeah,
Yes, I do.
perfect. And it's kind of cool. This one's a little different. It's a little strange. Definitely a good way to finish off the series of these cards. Why don't you talk about this one a little bit?
Yes. So this card, being one of the ultra rares, one of the 5 for the 1013 expansion, originally titled Stiletto Weapon, what ultimately became Alien Stiletto. I think a more suitable title for this otherworldly device that was so important to the show's mythology. So the game effect itself remained the same. The rarity of this card is interesting, although it ultimately was one of the 5 ultra rares at the time that this playtest card was conceived. It was listed as rare.
Yeah.
It speaks to probably the idea is like prior to the Alien Stiletto, none of the equipment cards had ever been relegated to ultra rare status. And so this is an idea that must have occurred to them at a later point. And I think it was a good choice because the Alien Stiletto is, again, a key piece of X-Files iconography and deserving of ultra rare status. And also not just because of that, but because the effect itself is quite unique for an equipment card.
Oh, yeah. I play with 2 of these in my deck. I sell it if I have to, but it's one of the few equipment cards that's its activators in the field versus the bureau.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can get this attached to an agent in the field, next turn, that's 10 resource points. Well, and this is one of the 2 cards that has the no TC video call NXT thing, and I gotta tell you, man, you got some rare stuff over there on your end, man, because you got this card. I don't even have one of these cards, so I gotta give you props, man. That's awesome.
And really, I didn't notice that little note on there at the time when I selected it. I knew I wanted an ultra rare, but I wasn't necessarily inclined to go with some of the other ones. I wanted this one. And because Tele Takumi is my favorite of the season finales. So again, this was just one of them that I had to have, even though the game effect itself was still the same and there weren't much else changes, whether it be to the flavor text and even the title was only changed ever so slightly. But noticeably, like the bluffs, we don't have that 1A, 1B. We only have a letter for this case. So for the bluffs and the equipment, simply a letter. And again, here's hoping we'll get an interview with Brian and maybe he can clear up just some of those little curiosities that come with these playtest cards.
When I got into this, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm keeping Kresge. I'm absolutely keeping Kresge. That's the one card. That's our favorite interview. Again, if you haven't seen our David Lewis interview, that's our...
come on. That is a great interview.
You were the one that was like, oh, you're not keeping Queequeg? And I'm like, oh, crap. I got to keep Queequeg. So you guys are aware, too. Dax got a couple, too. In this whole thing, Dax is like, you've done enough. And I'm like, no, I haven't. What do you want? So I got Dax a couple of cards, too. But again, not to get over dramatic, but like, I cannot believe all you guys came together to help get our friend to Philefest. It's just so cool, man.
Yeah, you guys outdid yourselves, and I can't thank you enough either. It really cannot be overstated. You guys are making it so our dear leader, who for whom we wouldn't necessarily be doing these videos together and being able to play these games with one another had it not been for Dax, creating that Facebook group that brought this whole community together.
Yep.
And hopefully some of you will be able to join us at Philefest and get in on all the good times that we're sure to have for that very short weekend.
Yep. And, it's still 6 months away, but like, there are things that are happening now, like behind the scenes, where we're going to go hang out with these people and do these different things. And if you want an opportunity, not only David May, David Frank are going to be there. Obviously, Dax is going to be there. Me and Steven, we've got this team. Mike Mackey, who's going to be selling some amazing stuff and also giving.
Come get some merch.
Oh, my God. He's bringing the last, and I'm not even kidding. I'm not making this up. He's bringing the last of the uncut sheets. These are the last that exist, period. And he's bringing them to hopefully, get you guys one of these sheets if you want. I've got two. You've got one behind you there, right? Yeah. I mean, these things don't exist anymore, man. They're impossible to get your hands on. And like I mentioned today, I'm going to be giving away a signed No One's So Paranoid by all three of the actors. My goal is to come to Philefest with my pockets full of stuff for you guys and to leave with my pockets empty. I want to share this, and you know what? If all I get is some autographs and some photographs with some people, dude, it's an experience for me, an experience for you, and you're helping make it happen. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We hope you guys have enjoyed checking out these cards. If you stuck around to the end of this video all the way through, thank you. I got to do the standard YouTube thing where, as of the posting of this video, we're 199 subscribers. I'm trying to get to 200 because I'm not selfish. So give a like, give a subscribe, and you know what? Just email me. Let's talk. Go to the Facebook group. Let's talk about this stuff. If you have any questions on the video, message me, message Steven, message Dax. Dude, we want to share this. We want to continue to share this. So hit us up. And I guess, yeah, do you have any parting words there, Steven?
No, I just want to say, please post comments in this video. Let us know, what you like about the video, or if you have ideas for upcoming content that you'd like to see, let us know. If you even have leads on some of the people that were involved in the game that we have yet to reach out to, if you have any leads on this, I mean, this is, a chance to help us, get deeper into some of the nuances of this game's history. So, help us out with that if you happen to know. So again, thank you guys for taking part in contributing to helping us get Dax out to Philefest in September. And in exchange for that, you yourselves now have a small piece of the X-Files CCG's history in your possession. These playtest cards you're not going to be able to find anywhere else.
Yep, absolutely. And if anybody knows where Killer Carrie is, send her my way. We get a tournament coming up. I'll take you on, Carrie. We'll take you on.
Yep. She's got a title to defend.
She does. All right. We'll see you guys next time on Matt and Mike and Steven's X-Files, a CCG.
See you next time, guys.